On Chapter 1 of this podcast, we ended just as MST3K was taking the leap to this sort of big time on cable. This time we're going to discuss the world building, set building, and staff building that was 1989 to 1990, or as it's properly known, Season 1. I'm your host, Ryan Rodriguez, and this is the Coolness Chronicles. Chapter 2. Turn down your lights, where applicable. It's impossible to tell a complete and honest history of MST3K without discussing the fractured and fragile relationship between creator-slash-host Joel Hodgson and producer Jim Mallon. Ever since Joel left the show in 1993, the question of why lingered amongst fans. In interviews given in the years afterward, Joel was relatively cryptic about the departure, but hinted at creative strife. Relatively soon after the show ended, Joel became more candid, acknowledging that his feuding with Jim directly led to him leaving. And ever since that revelation, it seems that Josh Weinstein, Trace Beaulieu, Kevin Murphy, Mike Nelson, and later Mary Jo Pehl, Bill Corbett, and production designer Jeff Maynard all had their own separate grievances when the subject turned to Jim. Why? We'll get to those as they come, which isn't for a while, but it's just important to keep in mind as these parts progress. I'm going to try and play the long game here. Best Brains, the company that produced MST3K, was founded the day the contracts were signed for the cable deal. After they negotiated keeping the copyright to the show, Joel remembers the foundation accordingly. Jim then said to me, "The only logical thing is for us to be 50-50 partners, so we're not working for each other." And I shook his hand and said, "I'll run the creative, you run the business, and the technical." The name for their partnership originated from an old Vic Lawson magic catalog, in reference to an item being from the, quote, best brains in the magic business. Before the deal was finalized for 13 episodes, the executives, despite the ecstatic response from the compilation of the best of KTMA, decided to try and note the crew to death. From the Shout Factory documentary, The History of MST3K.
At the beginning, Comedy Central, or the Comedy Channel, wanted to change almost every aspect of the show.
We didn't really understand it at the time, but their whole model was to make it like MTV. Like, there would just be hosts who are setting up, funny movie clips.
We'd get these notes about, can you make it shorter? Can you do more than just a movie? Can you throw in some other stuff that we have?
And we didn't quite understand that. We were like a little worried that they were going to go, oh, yeah, you guys are going to be hosting movie clips. And that's probably what they were thinking.
And we kept saying no. And one of the most wonderful things you can have, a great position of power to have in that business, is the ability to say no to anything, because then you can negotiate and you can hopefully get what you want.
So the foundation for a real show on real television was set and firm, but it almost could have been built on very shaky ground. During negotiations, the executives initially insisted that the production move from Minneapolis to New York City, where the corporation behind the Comedy Channel had just built new studios. The MST3K crew knew that this would be a miserable experience for everyone involved, with Kevin believing that, had the show uprooted, it wouldn't have even made it to a second season. Jim, Joel, and Kevin, panicking while touring the new studio, deftly pulled a fast one on the executives. They banked on the relatively low ceilings in the facility and argued that because the show relied heavily on puppets, it would require puppet trenches and an elevated set, and the New York stages didn't have that space required. They didn't bother to mention that the KTMA set didn't have the space required either, nor did they have an alternative facility. But whatever the reality of the situation was, the show got to stay in town, upgrading to an empty warehouse in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. Also, they lucked out that their humble beginnings were nestled in the Midwest, and, as Kevin later said, the reason that the show got to grow was because nobody wanted to come out to Minnesota. Because of the distance between the network and Best Brains, corporate meddling was kept to a minimum, and with an increased budget, not by much, but increased nonetheless, it was time to upgrade the visual aesthetic of the show, starting with the Satellite of Love. Trace and Joel collaborated on the redesign, with the bridge reformed as a geodesic dome in reference to Silent Running, and the satellite exterior becoming bone-shaped, paying homage to the opening scene of 2001: A Space Odyssey, a film that will become very important to the narrative of the show later on. Also of note, it was revealed on the Movie Sign with the Mads podcast that Trace had a very different, very fitting film in mind when putting together the rest of the design elements.
Called Dark Star, which was heavily influential on me on art direction.
You know what? I've never seen it, but I know that Dan O'Bannon was heavily involved with that, and that was before Star Wars too, right?
Yeah, a lot of the design, Ron Cobb, who went on with Dan O'Bannon, worked on Aliens. A lot of those guys started there, but it's incredibly cheesy looking effects and art direction.
Yes, it's time to discuss John Carpenter's directorial debut, the cult classic Dark Star. This choice of inspiration, given its production history, is more than a little ironic. How so? Let's pause the narrative for a minute and travel back to 1970. Dark Star is about burnt-out space truckers whose sole mission is to scour the universe and utilize artificially intelligent talking bombs to blow up, quote, unstable planets. Clearly, the creators had both sci-fi absurdism and Vietnam on the brain. Carpenter co-wrote the script with fellow legend Dan O'Bannon, who also starred, and whose invaluable work on Alien, Total Recall, Heavy Metal, and Return of the Living Dead will be discussed in a future chapter. Throughout the film, we mostly follow O'Bannon's character, Sergeant Pinback, as he goes about random missions on their malfunctioning spaceship. Things like feeding an alien that looks like an inflated tomato, and getting stuck dangling from a service elevator while his fellow truckers try to deal with an energy storm that activates one of the self-aware bombs, which they have to try and reason with before it destroys the ship. I'm trying to stay away from explaining or detailing too much about this film for the same reason that I limited my discussion on Silent Running. Most people haven't seen it, and it's easily one of the greatest science fiction films ever made, much less from the 70s. It utilizes its shoestring budget in ways that are truly admirable, and it packs a style and a sense of humor that puts it in a category without many peers. And, as a Marvel Comics nerd, I view it as the clear forefather of Guardians of the Galaxy and the related franchise. From the general vibe of doofuses lounging around in spaceships between acts of destruction, to the use of contemporary music in a cosmic environment. For instance, here's the start of the opening credit sequence of Dark Star.
Let's have some music in here, Boiler. Sure thing.
Sunshine down, but I see only one. When I think I'm over you, I find I've just begun. The years move faster than the days. There's no warmth in the light. And how I miss those desert skies, your cool touch in the night. Kingston, Arizona, blue warm wind through your hair. My body flies the galaxies, my heart longs to be there.
Dark Star was first produced as a 16mm student film while Carpenter and O'Bannon were students at USC, and filmed from 1970 to 1972. Their fellow classmates served as actors, crew members, and animators. Carpenter composed the score, which would become something of a hallmark during his later career, and O'Bannon worked on the editing and special effects. The budget for the original student film was $1,000, and it ended up clocking in at $6,000, and it shows. Every set looks cramped because they had to be, every prop looks handmade because they were, and the limited special effects are accomplished in ingenious ways. Sound familiar at all? The first cut of the film was 50 minutes long, which was too long to circulate on the international student film circuit. Carpenter and O'Bannon were repeatedly told that despite their efforts, their film would never be seen in its current state, so they started seeking financing to expand it to a feature length. The cast and crew started cobbling together extra money with the help of financier Jack Murphy, who in a later interview Carpenter would only identify as, quote, some guy from Canada, and filmed an additional 50 minutes of material. They soon began shopping the film to distributors, but nobody was biting. O'Bannon's buddy John Landis had just finished his first feature film, Schlock, completed by producer-distributor Jack Harris, and he introduced Harris to the Dark Star crew. Harris liked what he saw in Dark Star. Kinda. What he didn't like, he simply demanded be cut, and more often than not, what he didn't like was the most precious to O'Bannon and Carpenter. But Harris was going to distribute their movie, so they complied with his demands. Extensive editing knocked the film's runtime back to a non-feature length digits, so Harris insisted on 35mm reshoots to pad the film. When O'Bannon was asked about the finished product, he was nothing if not typically blunt.
It was disappointing, really. We had what would have been the world's most impressive student film, and it became the world's least impressive professional film.
Carpenter seemed to take the obstacles presented by Harris's involvement in stride simply because he wanted to finish the production and move on to bigger and better things. But O'Bannon raged against the machine and even took advantage of his special effects position by creating some unique graphics on a few computer monitors.
The first person to turn against Jack was Dan O'Bannon. His hatred of Jack grew and grew until he just really couldn't stand the movie. And Dan, I felt, Dan just couldn't stand him anymore. If you look at the movie Dark Star, if you ever get a chance, there's a moment in the movie, you'll see in the screen, it's flashing by, you'll stop it, it says, "Fuck Harris." O'Bannon couldn't take it.
And while Carpenter and O'Bannon had different ways of dealing with their distributor, their personal relationship with each other slowly soured, and this is where the parallels to MST3K begin. If you're familiar with the fraught partnership of Joel and Jim, the following audio of art director Tommy Lee Wallace and Carpenter, taken from a great documentary by Daniel Griffith, will sound awfully familiar.
It was a heady team, the two of them collaborating. I guess it was inevitable that it might not last because they were both such powerful personalities and creative forces.
He and I had quite an intense relationship, but it became a duel of control. And the last thing I think any director wants is another guy who wants to be a director.
Any goodwill between Carpenter and O'Bannon was never rekindled, with both men refusing to contact one another in the years to come. Tragically, Dan O'Bannon succumbed to complications from Crohn's disease in December of 2009, but his body of work still stands tall, and I promise that we'll get to all of it sooner rather than later. And despite the drama, a great, if not compromised, film was produced, and eventually, through home video, a condensed, subtly improved director's cut was compiled and released. Watching it today, it cements Trace's decision to emulate the film's look and effects, or lack thereof, as a masterstroke. And now we need to take the ultimate trip back to 1989 to continue MST3K's trajectory. But as elaborate as the vision for the show was getting, the cast and crew were in a time crunch and had to make some compromises, mostly in the completion of the set. The first checks to pay for the show arrived at the beginning of October of 1989, and the first official episode aired the week after Thanksgiving, giving everyone involved just 6 weeks to turn their newly acquired warehouse into the Satellite of Love, the Mystery Science Theater, and Deep 13, the underground lair of Dr. Forrester, as well as write, shoot, and fully produce the first episodes. They had time to fabricate and assemble the bare minimum envisioned. For instance, on the bridge, there's supposed to be a control panel with 3 giant light buttons that Joel uses 3 ways. 1, to initiate communication with the Mads. 2, to open the doors to the theater when movie sign is activated. And 3, cut the video feed when it's time for a commercial. When the first season started, this panel was entirely absent. For the first few episodes, Joel would simply hit the desk on the bridge where the panel should be. They did have time to spruce up the robots, with Servo getting the color scheme he would sport for the remainder of the series, and differing from the established model only in that his slinky arms were made of the same piping as Gypsy's neck until Season 2. Crow's redesign was similarly improved, although he would continue to evolve 2 or 3 more times in the course of the show to increase the emotive abilities of his eyes, which are probably his best feature. Also fully executed was the new doorway sequence that would last throughout Joel's run on the show. Instead of a series of random openings in succession with the use of blue screen, a miniature model hallway with 5 doors, numbered in descending order from 6 to 2, and an exit/entrance hatch was built. The doors themselves ranged from fencing to translucent mesh with tiny tiki torches adorning it, and the transition from the hallway to the theater came through the hatch, separating the hallway from the theater. Also fully executed was the new doorway sequence that would last throughout Joel's run on the show. Instead of a series of random openings in succession with the use of blue screen, they built a miniature model hallway constructed of 5 doors numbered in descending order from 6 to 2, concluding with an exit/entrance hatch. The doors themselves were made up from everything from fencing to translucent mesh adorned with tiny tiki torches. The color scheme on the bridge of the SOL during this season suffered the most from the production time crunch. Instead of the elaborate finished look of Season 2, the walls were covered in green octagonal stenciled outlines and not much else. At least I think they're green. I'm colorblind, so don't take my word for it. That said, as these episodes progress, I will continue to attempt to describe the colors of this show, and in some cases, fail on an epic scale. You have been warned. The lighting was also improved later, but in these first 13 episodes, if you look at the edges of the frame during the host segments, you can clearly see the shadows of Trace and Josh puppeteering throughout. The final major retooling was the allowance of a remixed theme song, one that relied mostly on the same lyrics as before, but altered to establish a new, concrete narrative that would allow for world building.
In the not-too-distant future, next Sunday AD, there was a guy named Joel, not too different from you or me. He worked at Gizmonic Institute, just another face in a red jumpsuit. He did a good job cleaning up the place, but his bosses didn't like him, so they shot him into space. We'll send him cheesy movies, the worst we can find. He'll have to sit and watch them all, then we'll monitor his mind. Now keep in mind, Joel can't control where the movies begin or end, because he used those special parts to make his robot friends. Robot, roll call, Cabot, Gypsy, Tom Servo, Crow. You're wondering how he eats and breathes and other science facts. Then repeat to yourself, it's just a show. I should really just relax. For Mystery Science Theater 3000.
In the first attempt at the opening credits sequence, the exterior of the Gizmonic Institute is built on what looks like an active volcano built out of styrofoam rock clumps, not unlike Devil's Tower in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Surrounding buildings were made out of what looks like egg cartons, but could also be foam ice cube trays, all splayed out on rumpled green felt, ineffectively made to resemble grass. And even though this show is known for having very low, but transgressively high production value, the original models were really ugly. However, decidedly non-ugly is the show's now iconic logo, a moon bearing the words Mystery Science Theater 3000. It's featured at the end of the theme song, as well as during most commercial breaks, and was made out of a giant fiberglass ball covered in spray can foam insulation, with the title, rendered in foam cutouts, squished on the front of the ball. What I love most about the finished effect of the original moon logo is that it's both iconic and visually interesting, but still almost impossible to properly describe. Personally, I would call it a brain moon, although I've also heard a spaghetti ball as an apt description. For the 2017 relaunch, it was redesigned to resemble the actual moon, with squiggles of insulation nowhere to be found. But again, we'll get there when we get there. Though I don't believe it was ever said on screen, the full name of Joel's employer was the Gizmonic Institute of Naive Science, known as a place where people who aren't good enough to be scientists go to be scientists. Joel also changed his character's last name to Robinson, which I only realized about 4 months ago was a reference to Lost in Space Will Robinson. And like Will, Joel is, yes, lost in space. I can be a real dipshit sometimes. The biggest change to the format of the show was the invention of Deep 13, the aforementioned underground lair of Dr. Forrester and Dr. Earhart. It was established in the first Cable episode as a radioactive sub-basement of the Institute, one that the Mads have to sneak into every episode in order to conduct that week's experiment. They would start each episode by waiting for the invention exchange to begin. One of the facets of Joel's stand-up act involved quote-unquote inventions or physical props that would serve as punchlines to his jokes. The exchange was designed as a cold open that didn't have to be narratively motivated and didn't have to be character-driven. Though I don't believe it was ever said on screen, the full name of Joel's employer was the Gizmonic Institute of Naive Science, known as a place where people who aren't good enough to be scientists go to be scientists. Joel also changed his character's last name to Robinson, which I only realized about 4 months ago was a reference to Lost in Space Will Robinson. And like Will, Joel is, yes, lost in space. I can be a real dipshit sometimes. The biggest change to the format of the show was the invention of Deep 13, the aforementioned underground lair of Dr. Forrester and Dr. Earhart. It was established in the first Cable episode as a radioactive sub-basement of the Institute, one that the Mads have to sneak into every episode in order to conduct that week's experiment. They would start each episode by waiting for the invention exchange to begin. One of the facets of Joel's stand-up act involved quote-unquote inventions or physical props that would serve as punchlines to his jokes. The exchange was designed as a cold open that didn't have to be narratively motivated and didn't have to be character-driven. This, however, would change as the invention offered by the Mads could build on the personalities of the Mads themselves, and where the first season's worth of Joel's inventions were utilized as his stand-up. This, however, would change as the invention offered by the Mads could build on the personalities of the Mads themselves, and while the first season's worth of Joel's inventions were introduced by him alone, as the show would continue to evolve, the bots got to have a say in the invention, which elaborated on the motivations and skills of every character on the bridge instead of just being a monologue. After the exchange, Forrester would introduce the experiment, signal the movie sign, and force Joel and the bots into the theater, with them exiting every 20 minutes or so for a short sketch. After the film had concluded, Joel would ask the bots to name one good thing and one bad thing about the movie to be rewarded with RAM chips if they cooperated. These types of bookends were unfeasible during the KTMA days, as all the host segments, including the end of the episode, were written and shot before anyone had even seen the movie that they were about to riff. This is one of the few aspects of the show that was ditched previous to the start of the second season that I actually miss, as it gives a great chance to demonstrate the parent-child relationship between man and his bots, with Joel shunning every rude answer from Crow, which is often, or discouraging negativity from both Servo and Crow. Joel would later liken this type of interplay with himself and the puppets to that of a ventriloquist relationship with his dummies, or that of Dave Seville trying to rein in his chipmunks. But my favorite update to the show during Season 1 was Charlie Erickson's closing theme, dubbed Mighty Science Theater, in which he slows the opening to a somber yet bombastic tempo and orchestrates it like Philip Glass. It's a song so beautiful that I either want to walk down the aisle to it or have it play at my funeral. In fact, when I eventually die of syphilis, excuse me, I meant old age. Disregard the syphilis. I will eventually die of old age and definitely not syphilis. As my surviving family loads my cremated ashes into a capsule to be jettisoned into the sun, I request that Mighty Science Theater play from the greatest speakers humankind has ever invented. I have it in my will. I just want to make sure that it's on public record in case someone tries to thwart my plans. It's so beautiful, in fact, that I've even incorporated it into my writing. For 3 years now, I've been writing a spec script treatment based on the Marvel comic of Weird World. To summarize it without boring you, it's about a half-Hispanic, half-Caucasian 17-year-old girl on the autism spectrum named Marissa, who lives in a world
where Marvel Comics are just that, comics. Through a plot development that will be explained throughout the narrative, she ends up being warped to an alternate dimension, Weird World, where everything defies logic, sense, and reality. While in this dimension, she finds companionship in two unlikely allies, Howard the Duck and Peter Porker, the spectacular Spider-Ham, who also each come from their own different universes. While the denizens of this dimension hail Marissa as a prophesized leader and savior, she rejects any notion of destiny. Instead of facing down an antagonist, she simply decides to go on a road trip throughout the world, searching for the nexus of all realities, which is essentially a portal home. As she and her companions navigate the perils of this dimension, they encounter characters and concepts that Marissa recognizes from her comics. There's the Valley of the Man-Things, Ape Lantis, an intellectual Hulk from the future called the Maestro, a humbled Doctor Doom in Iron Man's armor, the black magic of Morgana Le Fay, who dreamcasting would be Isabella Rossellini, an encounter with Uatu the Watcher, the Magma Men, and Archon the Barbarian, just to name a few. As her comic knowledge and her various disorders begin to help her overcome almost any obstacle, she begins to question her sanity and her place in the multiverse. I'm really holding back on the larger details and twists because I honestly think that I have something special here, and I don't want to diminish any impact it could have if, as unlikely as it is, it ever got produced. But, years before landing on this particular concept for a treatment, I had this idea in my head of someone floating silently through space in some kind of cosmic river between planets while Mighty Science Theater played in super stereo in the background. And this is years before I stumbled upon medicinal edibles to aid in my depression, so this was an act of stone-cold, sober weirdness. When I started writing the official treatment, I realized that this idea was perfect for Howard's cosmic trip from his home world to the dimension of Weird World, and it's the one idea that has remained constant and untouched throughout every draft. Mainly because I love the song so much, but also because if I get that image put to sound on a theatrical screen, and just that, I could never work again and still die satisfied. I'd like to pause for a minute and be a total whore and beg Kevin Feige of Marvel Studios to read my treatment. I may not have an agent, or credits, or even a spot on the blacklist, and I know he'll never listen to this. I'm not even sure anyone else is listening. But in case this little podcast crosses his ears, I work cheap, and I'm not a member of any union. End begging. Speaking of writing, network money and resources meant that the cast and crew could actually sit down and write the script for the entire show, as opposed to scribbling together host segments and improvising through the entire movie. When the crew realized that this new incarnation of MST3K needed a staff and support people, Josh recommended that his friend and fellow comedian Michael J. Nelson, who already knew most of the cast and crew through the local comedy scene, join the staff as a writer. For Mike, it was basically a life preserver. In his own words, "At the time I was hired, I was a waiter/comedian, and I was working at TGI Fridays so I could have a flexible schedule. My stand-up was a little bit heady. I would do an impression of Robert Frost, which was tough in places like rural Wisconsin and Minnesota. People didn't want experimental stuff. They wanted their dick jokes, and they wanted them now." Mike would, at the end of the first season, become the head writer of the show, which at the time had a different meaning. When he started, Mike was one of the few people in the offices who could actually easily navigate a word processor, so he became essentially the designated typist. It was through his sense of humor and decisiveness that, by season 2, Mike would be responsible for organizing a collective of jokes and observations into something coherent that could be rehearsed and performed with ease. The increase in production time allowed the writers to not only watch the movies in their entirety before riffing them, but also watch them more than once and slow down the tapes to watch them in greater detail. By the 8th season, the writing sessions typically lasted 2 days' worth of viewings, constantly pausing and rewinding to obsess over tiny details, or the lack thereof. But even with this luxury, in the process of the first season was, as Kevin put it, like herding cats. But I would argue that it was more like herding cats with dry wit. Everyone had their comedic niche, and sometimes niches would intersect and blossom. It was essentially a bunch of funny people in a room watching TV and making jokes at the expense of whatever was on the screen. If a line got a reaction, it was written down, and more was written down than got used. Sometimes, riffs would be born from reactions to previous riffs. Because the people in the room were not disciplined television writers, they didn't adhere to any traditional structure. The organization of this process would continue to blossom until the very last episode, as a new writer was brought aboard
practically every season, with the crew occasionally chipping in as well. When looking back at Season 1 in the Amazing Colossal Episode Guide, Mike notes about Episode 108, The Slime People. As funny as the episode was, I wish we could do it again with a full staff of writers. It's a perfect movie for us. After writing was finished, the script was assembled with time code in a process called line assign, which decided which characters were given which riffs. It usually works in a way that lets each of the riffers get one line or observation each in a row, then repeat as needed, with people occasionally getting more than one riff in a row if that joke in particular needed someone's unique impersonation, or in later seasons when Kevin took over for Servo, singing abilities. The host segments were secondary to the theater sequences in terms of writing, but they gradually evolved, sometimes incorporating unrelated gags, but mostly using the time to comment on the films directly. Soon, whole storylines began developing, and characters got deeper. Particularly in Season 1, the host segments were wraparounds in the strictest sense. Watching all of the season in one day, it becomes incredibly evident that the show was discovering its own identity, with the only real constants being the opening invention exchange and a closing sequence with Joel asking the bots to say one good thing and one bad thing about the movie. Everything in between was essentially written by committee, with Mike describing these halcyon days as everybody just throwing in stuff until we had a big pile of words, and I think it shows. There are glimpses throughout the first 13 episodes of the genius that was to come, but it's a rough and rocky first few steps. Occasionally, simply reading the title of the film during the theater segment would count as a riff, and there were even gags that broke the show's rules, like adding sound effects or otherwise interacting with the film as opposed to reacting to it, but these anomalies would be eliminated relatively quickly. The host segments were videotaped since the beginning in single-take master shots for two reasons. One, a host segment captured in one complete take would give consensus on the set between the performers and the director over whether or not they could move on or decide where to improve. Two, in the fiction of the show, Joel communicates to the Mads and the audience through the lens of Cambot, thus cutting between different angles would break the interior logic of the show entirely. Flub lines, unexpected reactions, and occasionally visual mistakes would continue to surface in the show as it grew, but it's never more evident than in the first season. If you were to hold a drinking game for every flub line in the first 13 episodes, you would either need a liver transplant or you'd already be dead from alcohol poisoning. Also in a developmental flux were the iconic silhouettes. They would alter from episode to episode in terms of visual clarity and crudeness, sometimes capturing the contours of the bots and Joel's silhouette, sometimes resembling blocky amorphous outlines. The network also managed to do some light meddling in this area, initially complaining about the visibility of the silhouettes against black and white films, which comprised most of the first season. It was decided in editing to filter the films through a blue tint, which remained the status quo for a few years to come, but this meddling was unobtrusive. The same can't be said for other suggestions, like turning the silhouettes green in order to, quote, help the audience understand what's going on. The instances of this technique are few, but very distracting when you consider the fact that the amount of visual tricks attempted during the theater segments were not terribly substantial during this period, if they existed at all. But also introduced during this period was the last member of the SOL gang, Magic Voice. Played initially by production assistant Jan Johnson, Magic Voice was a non-corporeal female voice that informs Joel and the bots how much time they have before commercial sign, or occasionally chimes in during the cold open to give advice. She's listed in the episode guide under the category of robots, although it's never explicitly said that she was constructed by Joel or anyone else. She is simply heard when necessary, although she does get a sketch of her own in Season 6, so stay tuned for that. The film selection during the first season really ran the gamut of crap. But of course, that was entirely intentional, as Joel stated in a recent oral history. Film distributors would do this trick where they'd license you several movies. Half of them might be the movies that you'd heard of, and half were the movies we actually wanted, the B movies. We didn't want the cocaine. We wanted the baby laxative that they put in the cocaine. I'll be 100% upfront with you and double down on comments made in the previous chapter. What I have to say about the Season 1 episodes is minimal compared to future seasons for a simple reason. I'm not really fond of it. It's essential to document because everything has to start somewhere, but I wasn't exactly rushing to watch these episodes for research. We'll go from beginning to end, so we'll start with the second pilot, The Crawling Eye.
This alarm fills the night with terror, for high on a mountainside, a mysterious fear such as no human being has ever seen before.
We're
there are mountains, there are always clouds.
But this one remains static. On the side of the Trollenberg, it never moves.
Freak of nature.
A radioactive freak of nature?
It strikes without warning, wreaking death and destruction too horrible to behold. A force of evil that tortures its victims and hurls them mercilessly to the brink of murder and madness. What is it? And what does it crave, this creeping horror that hungers and thrives on human flesh, while it inhabits its own silent world that no man can penetrate? No one is safe from its spell of destruction, a cold, hypnotic stare striking fear into the hearts of all, creating a frenzied nightmare for those who behold it.
The cloud is splitting up.
Splitting up?
There are 4 of them now, and all moving this way.
The pilot episode of any series needs to make a statement about the show's mission to set the tone to follow. And for a series designed around riffing bad movies, what better statement than a terrible creature feature? This is something that has remained consistent with each relaunch of the show. For the sci-fi era, The Maiden Voyage was the subpar sequel to The Creature from the Black Lagoon, and for the Netflix era, it was the Danish Godzilla ripoff Reptilicus. But the worst of the 3 still has to be The Crawling Eye. This might be mostly attributable to the fact that the show was still in a primordial ooze state, and for example of this, one of the very first riffs is literally Joel reading the title. But I think that any movie that features a monster that resembles a cheap version of the Cyclops slug from It Came From Outer Space, roaming the Alps, and killing people with fog would have to be a rough go. The movie isn't terribly memorable, other than its awfulness, but the episode does happen to have one of the cutest moments in the entire history of the show, and it's during the invention exchange. Joel's very first invention, the electric bagpipes.
And the robots of Ion have worked up a special cover version of Led Zeppelin's Whole Lot of Love. You ready, guys?
Ready.
2,
Rocket.
3. She's got a whole lot of love.
What a whole lot of love.
She's
You got a whole lot of love.
A really whole lot of love.
I love it. Look, Larry's corneas are bleeding.
There's one final thing I have to share about The Crawling Eye, and it comes directly from the episode guide, where Kevin Murphy reflects on the production and airing of this episode. I'll let Kevin's words speak for themselves. This was our premiere episode for the Comedy Channel, and we were proud. In 6 weeks, 8 of us converted a warehouse into a studio, designed and built our own geodesic bridge set and Deep 13, created costumes, completely redesigned and rebuilt the robots, shot the now famous doorway sequence, conceived, scripted, and taped the entire first episode. When the show premiered, we went to a bar in Bloomington, at the time the only town that carried the network. It was then that somebody came up and asked what the show was all about, and we told him proudly, "It's called Mystery Science Theater 3000. We produced it right here in Eden Prairie." Then the fellow, much impressed and full of beer, returned. "So, where do we find it?" And we proudly said, "On the Comedy Channel." And he said, "Oh, you mean Ha?" Ha was the competing 24-hour comedy network, and the only one with a real name, and thus became a festering carbuncle that would grow and hurt us every time someone said, "Oh, you mean Ha," which is every time we said we were on the Comedy Channel. Luckily for Kevin and the rest of the crew, after the conclusion of Season 2, Ha and the Comedy Channel merged and became Comedy Central, which I'll get to later. But I guess, up until that point, Ha was a real pain in the collective asses of the MST3K gang. The next experiment in the season was a 1958 Mexican horror movie.
A monstrous nightmare of terror turned loose in a fight to the death.
The robot versus the Aztec mummy.
They will bring you a night of terror. We dare you to see them, but don't come alone.
I know. The title alone totally sounds like a great movie, but the more you know about it, the more difficult it seems it would be to riff. The film was actually the third installment in a trilogy of movies, all made in the same year. And on top of that, a large chunk of this movie is a recap of what happened in those movies. Do you have any idea how hard it is to riff a montage of plot? Neither do I, but apparently it's hard. People tell me things. So what is the movie about? I assume it has something to do with a robot and a mummy of the Aztec persuasion. And since the movie wasn't a feature length, something that is evident in many B-movies of the period, which probably explains why double features were so prominent, this episode features the first of many short films that would be played before the experiment proper. Future seasons would rely on everything from segments of old episodes of General Hospital to meant-to-be educational industrial films. For the first season, whenever a film was under the required length, they used chapters of a 1951 Republic serial called Rock. And if you watch these segments and you start thinking of the Pacific Comics hero The Rocketeer, that's no coincidence. Dave Stevens, who created that character, which you may know better from the underrated 1991 Disney film of the same name that we'll discuss in a future chapter, was heavily inspired by this serial in creating the character and the universe he inhabits. Mr. Stevens was either really young when he saw Rocket Men from the Moon, or just takes inspiration from terrible things. According to Wikipedia, the serial's working title was Planet Men from Mars, and if you understood that title, I'd appreciate it if you explained it to me. The serial's protagonist is Commander Cody, a government agent who builds a rocket suit in order to fight nefarious villains. But since this is the 50s, it plays like Iron Man if Tony Stark were an upstanding, boring man with a stick up his ass. It even features a cosmic element within the moon called lunarium, which, to be honest, sounds like it could fit in well with at least some of the comics that I actually enjoy. So maybe I was too harsh in my initial assessment of this serial. And no matter how silly it sounds, it couldn't be worse than Unobtainium. The episode itself harkens back to my earlier comments about the show being in the primordial ooze phase, as 2 gags are executed and then apparently warranted a full apology when the episode guide was published 7 years later. From Mike. We look back with embarrassment at 2 particular gags. One involved Joel covering the mouth of a woman singing and the singing being muted. The other, even more shameful, was adding the sound of men urinating when there was a shot of them with their backs turned. Both broke the rules of the show, and both were quite stupid. Wow, that's harsh. Accurate, but harsh. Experiment 103 tackled the Sam Newfield-directed The Mad Monster, a low-budget ripoff of Universal's The Wolfman.
In a forgotten mansion deep in a dismal swampland, a scientist, crazed by his lust for revenge, repairs the last detail of a diabolical death plan.
A few moments ago, Petro was a man, a harmless, good-natured man. Look at him now. He's no longer human. He's a wolf, snarling, ferocious, lusting for the kill.
The beast strikes swiftly, the first of 4 violent, fiendish murders. Into this crime-ridden situation, a reporter finds the biggest story of his career.
What should make a gory enough story for your paper? This is more than just a story to me. He was my friend.
Joined by the girl he loves, these 2 follow the gruesome trail of the mad monster. Every lead proves false. Then, one night, a strange, ominous power draws this girl to a rendezvous with death.
Newfield would go on to have 3 more of his movies given the MST3K treatment, all for one reason. He was truly a special director. He started low and proceeded to get lower over a large period of time. Of interest to perhaps no one other than myself, Universal would hold no grudges against the Wolfman in Mad Monster himself, Glenn Strange, because they cast him as a replacement for Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster in several films, most notably Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. I actually played a clip from this episode in Chapter 1 of this chronicle, which involved a slightly modified version of Servo attempting to seduce Joel's blender. Only in the research process did I discover that the sketch actually contains an outtake that had been circulated amongst Misties on YouTube. During shooting, whenever the puppeteers, or if you don't want to call them that, robots, blow a line or forget their cues, they tend to stay in character, which is infinitely delightful. In fact, there are 2 official gag reels dedicated to this quirk, called Poopy and Poopy 2, which we'll get to a little later. This is a clip featuring Josh blowing a line during the blender sketch and managing to stay in character while expressing some thoughts that were a little too raw for a puppet show.
I really like Juice in the Head. It's really a turn-on to me, my little scientific calculator. Ever gotten a wild hair and just filled your head with guacamole? I know I have. I've got it. I'm gonna leave now, and I'm gonna go fuck myself.
The next episode is a tricky one. Technically, Women of the Prehistoric Planet is the 4th episode of the first season. But that experiment was written and shot as the season finale. Why? From Kevin, via the episode guide. 104 actually was the last show produced in the first season. Near the beginning of the season, the channel was unable to come up with a movie for us in time to shoot 104. So we skipped that and went directly to 105 instead. So after we finished shooting 113, we returned to 104 and shot that show. Why didn't we just call show 105 104 instead and move everything up so that 104 would actually be 113? That's a very good question. Because of this issue, we have to table this episode and save it for the end of the chapter. Moving on to episode 105, the Bela Lugosi opus, The Corpse Vanishes.
To love, honor, and obey, until death do you part.
I do. Oh!
Shall I telephone for the ambulance?
No. The Undertaker. She's dead.
Mysterious murder strikes at the altar, and the maniac monster creeps from his domicile of death to claim the lifeless form of his latest bride. Police baffled, a public in terror, but nothing can stop this fiend on his hideous trail except a girl reporter who wages a brave, foolhardy fight against the blackest art this side of the grave.
Why have you a mausoleum in the basement? All those dead girls and that horrible dead creature.
My dear, you must have had a bad dream.
Now look, Professor, this was no dream. You wanted to see me, Reverend?
Given that it stars Bela Lugosi and was produced more than 2 years after Dracula, this is a predictably terrible film. And I don't want to drop a major spoiler, but the title technically describes the first 20 minutes of the film. A better title probably would have been The Corpse Vanishes, and then somebody looks for it and starts the plot. It's a little wordy, but I think it's more appropriate. Next up, Experiment 106.
God, Steve, help me! Help me!
Claude, what does it mean I'm stacked?
Stacked? You'll experience a new dimension in motion picture thrills when you see The Crawling Hand. The Crawling Hand demands to live, commands you to see it. A disembodied hand holds the key to a killer more deadly than the supernatural. The remains of an astronaut destroyed in space fights for life. A requiem for an astronaut.
He's a killer. He doesn't come over here quietly and put that bottle down, I'll have to shoot him.
But he's just a kid!
This was actually the only first season episode that I had watched prior to doing research for this episode, and that was about 12 years ago. I remember distinctly having a very odd sense of disorientation for about 15 minutes, at which point I ejected the DVD and put on a later episode. Seeing it again, I must say that I admire a host segment in which Joel, Servo, and Crow are all imitating William Shatner as they're being mock-strangled by disembodied hands. And apparently I'm not alone in feeling that way, because it was one of the few host segments to be recycled entirely, played as a flashback late in Season 2. But we'll get to that eventually. Experiment 107 featured probably the most well-known movie pre-riffing that the movie would ever do, although one could make the decent argument for the riffing of Bride of the Monster in Season 4, or the 2 Godzilla movies in Season 2, although they're definitely not the most well-recognized of that series.
With the swiftness of a deadly cosmic ray, the Earth is invaded by indestructible moon monsters. Their ghastly mission, death for all humans. What astounding technical developments are being made to protect mankind. Robot Monster brings you an actual preview of the devastating forces of our future. Unsuspected revelations of incredible horrors that will terrify you with their brutal reality.
There is no escape from me. Very well. I will recalculate. Your death will be indescribable. Fool humans, there is no escape.
Robot Monster is a notorious turd from 1952 that I like to think of as an accidental, incompetent facsimile of a David Lynch movie 25 years before Eraserhead. It features a little boy dreaming that an alien named Roman, played by a man in a gorilla suit with a diving helmet, is attacking helpless Earthlings. And that's the least crazy balls thing about this entire movie. It's an exercise in stock footage and cobbling together disparate elements out of desperation instead of ingenuity. This particular experiment is probably the best example of my primordial ooze description, as it features a moment that truly, if granted the time, probably should have been retaped, but I'm entirely grateful wasn't. Toward the end of the short that precedes Robot Monster, Josh the person sneezes, and Josh the performer has to cover for it.
Bless you.
Whoa.
Zunt. You're not supposed to do that.
That stirred up my ROMs real bad.
It's a truly odd moment, and the simple fact that at the end of the take, the general consensus amongst everybody involved was to leave it in, that's awesome. MST3K truly was Adult Swim long before Ted Turner found a way to capture the attention of American 20-something male stoners. Moving on, Experiment 108 was aptly named.
From caves and sewers come the slime people. The kill, kill, kill. There is no escape from the slime people. The slime people. For a new adventure in terror, live through the wild bloodbath of the slime people.
Naturally, as the trailer infers, this movie was a modern-day adaptation of William Shakespeare's The Merry Wives of Windsor, only with 30% more slime people. But seriously, folks, this movie lives up to its title and then some. And if you think that's a mark of quality, enjoy. You will not be disappointed. But my favorite piece of trivia about this movie concerns one of the lead actresses named Susan Hart. She apparently didn't have to read for the role, as she was, quote, automatically cast on the basis of her attractive looks alone when she showed up for the casting session, end quote. And, after landing the role, she was given $35 to buy her own wardrobe. It was like this movie was aware it was riff-worthy in pre-production. Experiment 109 was Project Moonbase, which the official MST3K wiki page calls a quote-unquote feature film.
Orders from the minister himself that we must not fail in destroying this perpetually menacing eye in the sky.
But now that we have a satellite station in space, revolving around the Earth, a satellite view, I might add, directly to the heroic first orbital flight by Colonel Brightheist. Danger, adventure, and breathtaking thrills come rocketing to the screen as science smashes a new frontier in the world of tomorrow. See a man-carrying rocket travel 240,000 miles to land on a spaceship. See man explore the desolated areas of the moon. See for the first time thrilling pictures of the world of tomorrow.
The Joint Chiefs have conferred with the President and it's been decided to change your mission. You are now Moon Base number 1. You will remain where you are and show the flag until such time as you can be relieved by a larger permanent force.
In fact, it's actually cobbled together from several episodes of the unsold TV series Ring Around the Moon, and according to other sources, it was shot entirely in 10 days. Both of these facts are clearly evident if you try to watch it. One notable thing about the host segments is that at one point, Servo dons a Commando Cody helmet and momentarily looks like a cuter version of R2-D2. That is all. The next experiment, 1987's Robot Holocaust, was the most recently made movie to be featured on the show until the sci-fi era, which features numerous movies produced in the 1990s. Accordingly, it was also the first movie that had to be edited for content for the show, namely, boobies. Also, this episode featured a contest for fans to write in to the show and come up with names for a character referred to by the cast as only Avocado Scientist Guy. Other than that, I got nothing. Up next, Experiment 111, Moon 02.
Now! Blast off for the first Moon Western. The year is 2028 AD, and it's really like nothing on Earth. Here are the billion-dollar asteroids of the future. The bizarre machines. The fantastic weapons. The astounding moon treasure that pits man against man. The moon maidens that are part of the prize.
United Nations Space Charter, Section 99B. No sex is permitted in space.
This type of marketing leads me to wonder, were there cosmic environments that had westerns set on them, and this was a way to capitalize on that craze, like the time they made two competing Lambada movies, or the great Dante's Peak volcano rivalry of 1997? Were the filmmakers trying to start a new genre? Either way, they were unsuccessful. In terms of the host segments, I believe this is the first mention of Gypsy's ultimate reason for existing, according to her, Richard Basehart, the star of the television version of Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. Why is Gypsy fascinated with him? It's never explained, but it's awfully endearing. Experiment 112 was Untamed Youth.
Break her neck! Oh, break her neck! Break whose neck? Who cares? Anybody's.
Life is a matter of horse trading. Deals. Favors for favors.
You're so sure you're my desire, but you should be told, even with a blazing fire, you would leave me cold. But you're a slimy baby as a salamander, slip and slide away. Everybody go, go, calypso, go, go, calypso, go, go, calypso, go.
Sing the chorus.
Welcome, calypso.
Trinidad.
No, New York, New York. Where are the natives crazy mad?
New York.
Yes, New York.
Choosing to riff this movie is notable for two reasons. First, it was the first film to break the MST3K genre mold. Every movie chosen thus far was geared towards horror, science fiction, or monster movies, and this was a teen intrigue melodrama starring noted thespian Mamie Van Doren. Second, of all the episodes in the first season, this seems to be the one episode that has the most interesting behind-the-scenes stories behind it. Huh? From Trace. It's a little dangerous to say, yeah, we watch television all day, and it's really hard work. But you're watching the movie in second-by-second increments. It becomes an extremely grueling process. Josh will remember this better than I, but there's one movie that caused us to go out and get beer and tequila. And Josh. That was Untamed Youth. I don't think it was necessarily worse or better than any other film. I just think we were in a bad mood that day. We went out while we were writing it, got tequila and Mickey's Big Mouth, and got a little hammered. It didn't really up the productivity, but it elevated the mood, because it was drudgery. But the best anecdote of making this episode is not really an anecdote at all, but instead more of a whine. But a funny whine. From the episode guide, here's Kevin. This show was the basis for our first negative review from Gore Zone, a film magazine dedicated to the kind of movies in which people's heads explode like wood ticks, and bloody demon children are ripped from the loins of their usually naked hosts. In its Summer Bloody Summer issue of September 1990, sandwiched between a review of Dead Pit and Inseminoid, was a capsule summation calling our show the most insulting blow to the Comedy Channel's viewership, and complaining about the fact that we talked over Eddie Cochran's only song in the movie. We can only apologize to the folks at Gorezone and hope that the Criterion Laserdisc edition of Untamed Youth comes out soon, so they can experience the rich fullness of the Eddie Cochran in complete silence with rapt attention. Thank you, Gorezone, for revealing our unseen faults. We're sorry about what we've done to you, and we will never talk over another movie again, ever.
Well said, sir. Well said. Do you want a hug? I know I already addressed how this movie broke with tradition and the format for the show, but I do want to stress how important that actually is. Some of the best episodes of this series are the result of not fitting the mold, because the more different each experiment is, the more opportunities there are to discover new types of riffs, allowing the show to grow and become even harder to categorize. By venturing outside their comfort zone during a formative period, the MST3K crew gradually realized their potential and found a way to always remain relevant. Without Untamed Youth, there is no Side Hackers. There is no I Accuse My Parents. There is no Master Ninja. And that is not a world that I want to live in. Experiment 113 is more of a traditional pick.
Most terrifying news of all. At nightfall, monstrous animals crawl out of crater of volcano. Great herds of cattle stampede before this living inferno. Vast area devastated by appalling new horror. A creature named the Black Scorpion by panic-stricken people of San Lorenzo. Entire population prays for deliverance.
For miles around, cowboys came upon one dead steer after another. One of them had heard the tale of the demon bull of the Maricopa. Having lost family or friends, something absolutely unknown. He could be in another world.
Nation's leaders confer as news received a possible threat to capital.
This is a city of 4 million people. If word of these leaks out, the panic of the population could be worse than the scorpions.
The Black Scorpion destroys communications. Hundreds annihilated.
The Black Scorpion has two things going for it, one in terms of the movie and one in terms of the episode built around it. For the movie, it has special effects from stop-motion wizard Willis O'Brien, responsible for such stop-animated monkeys as the original King Kong and Mighty Joe Young. Naturally, for a movie titled The Black Scorpion, O'Brien was given the dramatic task of animating the title character, geologist Dr. Hank Scott. For the episode, in the first segment, the radiation levels of Deep 13 have finally begun to affect the Mads. Forrester starts the episode off as a skeleton and stays that way. It's pretty great. And finally, we come full circle and conclude the season with Experiment 104, Women of the Prehistoric Planet. In addition to being notable for its delayed production, the episode also spawned one of the show's most repeated catchphrases, Hi Kiba, usually uttered in fight scenes in tandem with or in place of Jim Kata, a reference to the 1985 movie of the same name.
I remember one time back at headquarters, I volunteered for a karate course. They taught me all the chops, the head, the neck, shoulder, stomach, the whole thing there. The karate kicks.
Now, who are you, Donald O'Connor?
Hi, Kiba! Hi!
This episode features the first guest appearance from future host and current head writer Mike Nelson, who would end up practically becoming a regular for bit parts during the next season all the way up until he started hosting. In this episode, Mike does voiceover for a visitor to the SOL, the Isaac Asimov literary doomsday device, which, when activated and detonated, turns Joel, Crow, and Servo into chattering doppelgangers of Isaac Asimov. It's all really adorable and esoteric, and I'm not even sure if I got most of the gags, but whatever. So here we are, 13 episodes down. It's February of 1990. It would be another 7 months before the show would air new episodes, and for a large period of time, the consensus over at Best Brains was that there probably wouldn't be a second season. Exactly how they wiggled out of that predicament will be discussed next time, but for this chapter, we end on a pretty seismic note nonetheless. After 2 years of playing Servo and Dr. Earhart, Josh decided to leave the show and pursue, well, he didn't figure that part out yet, but leave the show he did. The show would certainly never be the same in many ways, which we'll also discuss next week. But why exactly did he leave? In all the interviews Josh has given for the MST3K DVDs, and there's been quite a few, he's never really said. Satellite News, the official online newsletter of the show, run by one of the men who would be instrumental in a second season renewal, interviewed Josh shortly after the show left the air in 1999. Even if you don't look at the year that it was published, you can tell how old the interview is by looking at one of the later questions. And I quote, "What are your duties on the new Freaks and Geeks series?" This show, one of the greatest of all time, and one which will be discussed at length later, serves somewhat as a reunion for the original MST3K gang. Josh was in the writer's room, Trace had a minor recurring role as Mr. LaCavera, the biology teacher, and Joel appeared as a salesman that gets Jason Segel's character into disco in the series finale. The show was so good that it was doomed to fail on network television from the very beginning, and this is the only interview I've ever read where it's being discussed as a promising program in progress. Here's a passage from that interview. "I have no regrets. I'm glad I did the show, and I'm glad I exited when I did. Once the show moved to Comedy Channel, it became a very hostile environment for me to be in. After 10 years, I don't really feel like getting into the details, except to say that nothing good would have come out of me staying for anyone involved, except perhaps the viewing public." What is he referring to? As I understand the situation, the long answer is that he's talking about Jim Mallon. The short answer is that he's talking about Jim Mallon. Again, I want to stress that I have nothing against Mr. Mallon, and I will treat any grievances against him from fans as speculation until a cast or crew member confirms it. But I really don't think that there's an alternative theory to spin here. So who replaces Josh? Well, I think I already spoiled that. Hopefully you don't remember, but if you're aware of what this show is, then you probably do. Anywho, we're on our way to Season 2, and it's going to be a bumpy ride. Stay tuned on the Coolness Chronicles for Chapter 3 of the history and legacy of MST3K. But the show's not over yet, folks. Sorry. Every hour of this fine podcast concludes with a segment called Random Recommendations. Hammer Films is probably best known for their bloody revisionist horror movies of the late 50s and early 60s, usually starring late greats like Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee as iconic public domain figures like Dracula and Frankenstein's monster that were once the hallmarks of Universal. But they've also had considerable success in the science fiction department. Enter Professor Bernard Quatermass in a recommendation via Facebook from Anisha Frizzell, 1967's Quatermass and the Pit. Now, I will confess that while I didn't really care for this movie, I was loving it for the first minute or so. Why? The opening titles that I just played are almost certainly the main visual inspiration for the credit sequence of the greatest animated program of the last 2 decades. I know that it being a visual reference, pointing this out is probably lost in the listening audience, but I won't get to discuss Venture Brothers properly for another season or 2 of the show, and I just wanted to listen to the theme song again. It's that good. After the credits ended, I lost most interest in this movie. My esteem for Quatermass and the Pit may have been enhanced had I known that this was the third in a series of films, but I actually started my screening believing it to be a standalone movie, which actually hinders the tone rather immediately. How so? Well, the first 10 minutes follow construction workers expanding the London Underground and coming across some skeletons and a large metal object that they believe to be an unexploded bomb. By the halfway point of the runtime, it turns out to be a Martian spacecraft. But for these first 10 minutes, it feels like the movie is going to be set in the real world and slowly unveil sci-fi elements that the characters will attempt to rationalize. But seconds after the military shows up to intervene, we cut to military headquarters where stuffy British gentlemen are arguing, and all of a sudden I felt like I was in a different movie.
What is there to argue about? The purpose is quite clear.
Colonel Breen, my rocket group has been intended all along for peaceful scientific research.
Professor Quatermass, your rocket group?
Yes, mine. I brought the whole thing into being.
But it is, after all, a government project. And now the government has had a change of policy.
Change of policy? You're going to take it over and pervert it to this...
Listen, within 10 years, there will be permanent bases on the moon, perhaps even on Mars.
Previously in the film series, particularly the first movie, The Quatermass Experiment, the titular professor is launched into space in minute 1. But not knowing this, the discussion of moon colonization after adjusting to blue-collar blokes digging up vague mystery practically gave me tonal whiplash. The movie then continues to hobble along for the next 40 minutes or so, as Quatermass begins to cosmically theorize about the metal object's origins and purpose, and other people try to explain it as a leftover German weapon from World War II and other such earthbound nonsense. It's generally a chatty 40 minutes without anything of visual import occurring. Normally, I'm all for a chatty movie, but when you're talking about Martian spacecraft but the only visuals are stuffy British guys arguing in a clay pit, occasionally entering the craft and noting symbols, then exiting and talking about it some more, I quickly grew restless. A few minutes later, some insect creatures are discovered inside the craft, but they're dead and look like papier-mâché Halloween party decorations, and so the British people start theorizing and arguing about their origin for a few minutes. It isn't until the hour mark that things take a psychological turn, when a drill operator tries to open a sealed-off portion of the craft and ends up with alien visions rattling around in his brain as a punishment. Quatermass starts deducing that Martians landed on Earth during the dawn of man and began conducting physiological experiments on primitive cave people to boost their intelligence and therefore evolve the entire race before turning on their subjects and enacting the alien equivalent of ethnic cleansing, which is not too dissimilar to the origin of the Inhumans, which is a concept that I'd rather get behind. Naturally, as is wont to happen in a sci-fi movie involving skeptical government and alien technology, a general counters Quatermass's theory despite actual physical proof. He insists that the craft is just Nazi mindfuckery designed to make Londoners fear an alien invasion and stir irrational fear on a national scale, which is pretty far-fetched and kind of gives Nazi scientists a lot more credit than they deserve, as if playing the long game was really one of their strong suits. A press event is held, and suddenly the craft begins to feed on the energy of television broadcasts and begins to psychically affect those in the general vicinity, making everyone go into a violent frenzy, not unlike the villain's master plan in Kingsman: The Secret Service, which I'd also rather watch. There's also seemingly a connection between the appearance of the Martians and documented images of the devil, which seems like a weird point to make considering the main character is supposed to be a credible scientist, but that's a rant for another time. Apparently, the movie was originally a BBC television serial in the late 50s and was a big influence on legends like Stephen King and John Carpenter, and I've been assured by several other people that it's far superior in quality. Until I see it, however, this will have to serve as an end to this hour's random recommendation. Hit the end theme! Please send me your recommendations on Twitter, Facebook, or email, and make sure that you explain why you endorse it. I didn't ask that at first, and it actually made research more difficult. And before I conclude, I wanted to thank everyone involved in making MST3K for everything they've contributed to my life and to culture as a whole. Double thanks for also writing the episode guide that I will quote frequently in this season of the pod. I also want to thank Shout Factory for their excellent supplemental material that was invaluable to my research for this and every episode to follow on this subject. You can get the show on DVD on Amazon.com, but if you want to support the artists who made the wonderful show, many episodes are available on VOD on rifftracks.com. I'm not affiliated with any of these organizations, I just work here. Thank you for listening. Please rate and review the show on iTunes or your chosen source. If you enjoy the program, share it with someone else. This has been the best and largest endeavor I've ever seen to completion, and it would be nice to keep making the show until it just isn't fun anymore. Links to all subjects discussed on the pod can be found on our website at www.coolnesschronicles.com. There you can also email your questions, comments, or random recommendations. You can also contact me on Twitter at CoolnessPodRyan, or like our Facebook page and watch for updates. have suggestions for future seasons, as this series is not exclusively about MST3K, it's just the natural first topic, or even things that you want me to discuss that are MST3K related, send them right over. If you want to advertise on this program, I'm a total sucker for a sponsor, so I'll pimp out any product you have. Our next chapter will be posted soon, and until then, do what you love, don't be a dick, and as always...
The finger thing means the taxes!
I mean, goodbye, for now. Coolness Chronicles is written, produced, and edited by Ryan Rodriguez. Executive producers are Tracy Rodriguez and Luis Rodriguez. Original music by Bildschirm. Please visit bildschirm.bandcamp.com for more information.